He picked up his water glass like he was about to toast something, and in a way, he was. Your mother and I talked it over, Dad said, not looking at me. We're putting the house in Derek's name. He's got the kids, he needs the space more than you do. Nobody said anything. My sister-in-law, Paige, had that tight little smile she gets when she already knows something you don't. Derek stared at his plate like it was fascinating. My mother reached for the wine. I'd paid off that house 6 years ago. All of it. $230,000, wired straight to the mortgage company 2 weeks after my father's heart attack, back when nobody else in this family had $2,000 to spare, let alone $200,000. I set my fork down. Okay, I said. Dad's eyes finally came up to meet mine. He'd been braced for tears. For the version of me that used to apologize for taking up space at this table. He didn't know that version of me had left a long time ago, right around the time I signed the paperwork that made this house mine in every way that mattered on paper. I just smiled at him. Congratulations, Derek, I said and reached for my wine. Before I go on, if you've ever been the one who quietly held a family together while somebody else got the credit, hit subscribe, because this story is for you. It gets a lot more interesting from here. My name's Claire Whitman. I'm 34, I work in commercial real estate finance in Columbus, and up until that Sunday dinner in March, I would have told you I had a decent relationship with my father. Complicated, sure. Most families are. But decent. I'm the older of two. Derek's 31, married to Paige, 2 kids under 6. He sells insurance, or he did until he took a break 2 years ago to focus on the family, which as far as I could tell meant Paige's parents covering their mortgage while Derek coached Little League and posted a lot on Facebook about being a present father. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it matters later. Growing up, Derek was the easy one to love out loud. He was funny. He was affectionate. He hugged our parents without being asked. I was the one who got good grades and didn't need anything, which in my family was its own kind of invisibility. Nobody worries about the kid who doesn't need anything. Nobody throws her a parade for turning in her homework. So when my father called me on a Tuesday morning in October 6 years ago, and I heard him crying, actually crying, which I had maybe heard twice in my life, I didn't think twice. I'm going to lose the house, Claire, he said. The mortgage company's already sent the second notice. Your mother doesn't even know how bad it is. He'd had a heart attack 4 months earlier. 6 weeks in and out of the hospital, a business that couldn't run itself, medical bills stacking up faster than his part-time disability could cover. My mother had never worked outside the home a day in her life and didn't know how to read a bank statement, let alone save a house from foreclosure. Derek offered to look into some loan options, which meant nothing happened. I had savings. I'd been careful with money since I was 22. No fancy apartment, no car payment, a job that paid well, and a habit of not spending what I made. I had $230,000 sitting in accounts because I'd always told myself I was saving for a house of my own someday. I used it to save theirs instead. My college roommate Denise was a real estate attorney by then, and when I told her what I was about to do, she didn't try to talk me out of it. She just said, "You're not doing this without paperwork." I laughed. I told her this was my parents, not a business deal. Claire. She said my name the way she does when she's not going to let something go. Families are exactly who you need paperwork with. Not because you don't trust them. Because you love them, and people's memories get real convenient when love and money mix. I let her draft something. A simple agreement, a promissory note, and something called a deed of trust, filed with the county, securing my $230,000 against the property. My father signed it at his kitchen table without really reading it, the way you sign anything a doctor or a lawyer hands you when you're scared and grateful and just want the crisis to be over. "What's all this for?" he'd asked, pen already moving. "It's just protection, Dad," I said. "For both of us." He'd waved it off. "You're a good girl, Claire." I hadn't thought about that piece of paper in years. Not really. It lived in a folder in Denise's office and a digital file I forgot I had. I never once imagined I'd need it. Until Sunday when my father sat across from me at the table I'd saved and told me he was giving it to someone else. Growing up, I used to think love in my family worked like a scale that never balanced. Derek got the warmth. I got the responsibility. And for most of my life, I told myself that was fine, because at least I got to be the one people could count on. That mattered to me more than I probably admitted. My mother used to say it when I was a kid, half proud and half like she was letting herself off some hook. Claire doesn't need much. She said it the way you talk about a plant that survives without water. I heard it so many times I started saying it about myself. I don't need much. I'm fine. I'll figure it out. So when Dad called me that October morning crying, I didn't hesitate, but I also didn't do it only because I loved him. Some small, embarrassing part of me did it because it was the first time in 30 years anyone in that house had needed something only I could give. I drove to Columbus General that same afternoon. He was sitting up in bed, gray-faced, an oxygen line under his nose, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. My mother was in the corner chair, twisting a tissue in her hands. Derek wasn't there. Derek was on his way, a phrase that in my family usually meant several more hours, if it meant anything at all. I don't know what we're going to do, Dad said. I can't lose the house, Claire. Your mother's whole life is in that house. I remember exactly what I felt. Not obligation. Something closer to relief. Like I'd finally been handed the thing I was built for. You're not going to lose it, I told him. I'll take care of it. He grabbed my hand then, and his eyes filled up, and he said something I held on to for 6 years like a stone in my pocket. I don't know what I did to deserve a daughter like you. I wired the money 2 weeks later. $230,000. Every cent I'd saved since I was 22, the down payment on the life I'd imagined for myself, gone in one transfer. I didn't tell Derek the exact number. I didn't tell anyone but Denise. It felt like something private between my father and me, a thing I didn't need applause for. For a while, it actually was. For almost 2 years after that, my father called me every Sunday, just to talk. He asked about my job. He remembered the names of people I worked with. He drove up to Columbus once, alone, just to take me to lunch, which he had never once done when I was single and 30 and apparently invisible to him the rest of the year. I let myself believe something had shifted. That maybe saving the house had saved something else too, the part of him that had never quite figured out how to see me. Then Derek's insurance job didn't work out, and Paige got pregnant with their second, and somehow without me ever noticing the turn, all those Sunday calls started being about Derek again. Derek's stress. Derek's bills. Derek's need for stability, for the kids' sake. I didn't mind. That's the part that's hard to explain to people now. I didn't sit there keeping score. I was glad my parents had room in their hearts to worry about him too. I had my own life, a promotion, a condo I loved, a boyfriend who didn't last but was nice while he did. I told myself the house thing was settled. Handled. Behind me. I didn't know my mother had started calling it helping Derek get back on his feet when she talked to her sisters. I didn't know she'd started saying it in a way that left out where the money to save that house had actually come from in the first place. I found that out 3 months before the Sunday dinner when my Aunt Linda, half a glass of wine in at a cousin's baby shower, turned to me and said, "It's just so wonderful what your parents did for Derek. Buying him that house outright like that, no strings attached. Not everybody's that generous." I remember the sound of the room going soft and far away, the way it does right before you understand something you don't want to understand. "Linda," I said carefully. "What house?" Linda's face did the thing faces do when they realize they've said something they weren't supposed to say. She laughed a little, waved her hand like she was swatting the question away. "Oh, you know the house. Your parents' house. I just meant taking care of Derek's family the way they have." She reached for a deviled egg like it might rescue her. "Anyway, look at this spread. Doesn't the mother-to-be look radiant?" I let it go. Right there in the moment, at a baby shower surrounded by pastel balloons and a diaper cake, I let it go. Because making a scene wasn't something I knew how to do, and because some part of me didn't want to hear the answer badly enough to ask the real question. But it sat in me. For weeks, it just sat there, the way a splinter does before you notice it's infected. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not snooping exactly, just listening differently. And once you start listening differently, you hear things you'd trained yourself not to hear for years. My mother, on the phone with her sister, not knowing I was in the next room. "Well, we couldn't just watch him lose everything, Carol. A man needs to be able to provide for his family." Derek, at Easter, joking to Paige's brother-in-law. "Yeah, we got lucky. My folks came through big for us." A pause. A laugh. "Best thing that ever happened to us, honestly." Nobody said my name. Not once in any of it. 6 years, and in my own family's retelling, the $230,000 that came out of my accounts had quietly become something my parents did. Something they gave. Some story where I didn't exist at all. I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe it was shorthand. Maybe people just simplify things when they're gossiping at a baby shower or bragging to in-laws. Maybe I was reading too much into loose talk. That's the story I told myself for a long time, because the alternative was uglier than I wanted to look at directly. Then in February, I drove down to see my parents for my mother's birthday, and I noticed the mail on the kitchen counter. Property tax statement, addressed to my father, same as always. Except stapled behind it was something else. A letter from a mortgage company. Not the one I'd paid off. A new one. I wasn't trying to pry. It was sitting right there, face up, the way mail sits on a counter in a house you grew up in and still feel entitled to look at. Home equity line of credit. Approved. $85,000. My stomach did something strange and slow. I found my father in the garage, doing the thing he does with his hands when he doesn't want to talk, pretending to organize a shelf that had been organized the same way for 15 years. Dad, what's the home equity loan for? He didn't turn around right away. It's nothing you need to worry about. It's on the house, I said. The house I stopped myself. I don't know why I stopped myself. Some old habit of not asking for credit, even when I was owed the truth. What's it for? He turned around then, and for just a second, something crossed his face that I'd never seen directed at me before. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like being caught. Derek and Paige needed help with the down payment on a bigger place. 4 of them in that little townhouse. It's not sustainable, Claire, you know that. So you took out a loan. Against this house. It's my house, he said. Gently, like he was reminding a child of something obvious. I can do what I want with it. I didn't say anything for a second. I was doing math in my head, old math I hadn't done in years because I'd never needed to. The deed of trust. The promissory note. Whether a home equity lender would have even approved that loan if they'd pulled a full title search and found my lien sitting on the property. Did they know? I asked. The lender. Did they know there was already a note against the house? My father's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the look that meant the conversation was over whether I agreed or not. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Let it go, Claire. I walked back into the house without saying anything else. My mother was setting out birthday plates like nothing in the world was wrong. Derek's number was already lighting up my phone. A text, then another, then a third. Hey, Dad said you were asking questions. Everything okay? I stood in that kitchen holding my phone, and for the first time in 6 years, I opened the folder in my email marked simply, in his house. I didn't answer Derek that night. I told him I was tired from the drive, which wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Instead, I sat in my car in my parents' driveway with the engine off and read through 6 years of documents on my phone. The promissory note. The deed of trust, recorded with the county, Franklin County, filed the same month I'd wired the money. Denise's careful language spelling out exactly what I was owed and exactly what stood behind it. $230,000, secured against 4417 Brookhaven Lane in my name. It was still there. It had been there the whole time, sitting quietly in a public record, doing nothing, waiting. I didn't do anything with it that night. I told myself I needed to think. Really, I think I was still hoping there was a version of this where I was wrong, where my father had a plan, where the lien had been disclosed, where none of it meant what it looked like it meant. That hope didn't last 2 weeks. At the end of February, my mother called to invite me to what she called a family dinner, nothing special, on the first Sunday in March. Her voice had a brightness to it that I'd learned, over 34 years, to be suspicious of. My mother is not a woman who does casual invitations. Every dinner has a purpose. You just don't always get told what it is until you're sitting at the table. I asked Denise to meet me for coffee before I went. She read through everything again slowly, the way lawyers do, like she hadn't drafted the thing herself 6 years earlier. Then she looked up at me. You know this note is still fully enforceable, right? Nothing about giving Derek the deed erases it. If your dad transfers title to Derek, the property still carries your lien. It follows the house, not the owner. So if he gives it to Derek would be taking title to a house with a $230,000 lien on it, whether he knows that or not. She tapped the paper. Does Derek know about this? I thought about the mail on the counter. The home equity loan that had gone through, which meant either the lender hadn't done a proper title search, which happens more than people think, or somebody had found a way around disclosing it. Either way, nobody in that family had said my name once in connection with that house in longer than I could remember. I don't think anyone remembers I have anything to do with that house at all, I said. I think in their version, I'm just the daughter who happened to help out one time. Denise didn't say anything comforting. She's not that kind of friend, which is exactly why I trust her. She just said, then it's probably time you reminded them. I didn't have a plan yet. Not really. I told myself I was just going to that dinner to see what my father actually intended to say, to give him the chance to be honest with me before I decided what honesty from me would look like. I got to my parents' house that Sunday a little early. Derek's SUV was already in the driveway, Paige's minivan behind it. Through the front window, I could see my mother's good tablecloth already laid out, the one she only used for holidays and the one time my grandmother visited before she passed. Nothing special, my mother had said. I sat in my car for a minute before going in, the way I had 2 weeks before, except this time I wasn't looking at old documents. I was watching my family through a window, setting a table for an announcement I already half knew was coming, and I felt something settle in my chest that surprised me with how calm it was. Not dread. Not yet anyway. Something closer to readiness. I got out of the car and walked up to the front door, and my mother opened it before I even knocked, already smiling that bright, careful smile. There she is, she said. Come in, sweetheart. We've been waiting for you. Dinner started normal enough, which is its own kind of unsettling when you already know where it's headed. My mother had made pot roast, the good china was out, and for the first 20 minutes we talked about nothing. The kids' school, Paige's sister's engagement, whether the Buckeyes had a shot this fall. Derek kept glancing at Dad in a way I recognized from when we were kids, and he'd broken something and was waiting for our father to bring it up so he wouldn't have to. I ate my pot roast and waited too. It came with the second glass of wine, the way most things in my family do. Your mother and I talked it over, Dad said, and I already told you what came after that. The house. Derek's name. The performance of reluctant generosity, like giving away a $250,000 asset, was some hard call he'd wrestled with for my sake. What I didn't tell you is what happened after I smiled and said congratulations. Derek relaxed. Visibly. His shoulders dropped, and he reached over and squeezed Paige's hand under the table like they'd been holding their breath for weeks, waiting to see how I'd take it. And Paige couldn't help herself. She's never been able to help herself. We already talked to a contractor about the addition, she said, a little too brightly, a little too fast, the words tumbling out before anyone could stop them. For the nursery and a proper playroom. We're hoping to break ground this summer, once the refinance goes through. The table went quiet in a different way than it had a minute before. Refinance, I repeated. Derek shot Paige a look. She didn't catch it, or she caught it and decided it didn't matter anymore since the cat was out. We're going to refinance once it's in our name, Derek said, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. Cash out for the addition. Bank said as long as title's clear. It's not a big deal. As long as title's clear. I felt that phrase land somewhere behind my ribs. Not because it hurt. Because it told me something they didn't know they were telling me. That nobody had checked. That in 6 years, through a home equity loan and now a full title transfer being planned out over cocktails and contractor quotes, not one person in this family, and apparently not one lender either, had pulled a proper title search on that property. Or if they had, my lien had somehow gotten missed, buried, or ignored, which meant they were about to walk into something they had no idea was waiting for them. When's the refinance supposed to close? I asked, keeping my voice easy, curious, the voice of someone making conversation. Bank said 30 days once the deed transfer's recorded, Derek said. So, end of April, maybe first week of May. 30 days. I did the math without meaning to. Enough time to be careful. Not so much time that I could afford to waste any of it being polite. That's exciting, I said, and I meant it in a way none of them understood. My father was watching me now, and for just a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, More like the vague unease of a man who has told himself a story so many times he's forgotten there might be a different version of it. He'd expected tears. He'd expected me to push my chair back, or go quiet and wounded, or ask him how he could do this to me. He'd rehearsed, I think, for a version of this conversation where I made it hard for him. He hadn't rehearsed for a version where I just smiled and asked about their construction timeline. "You're taking this awfully well," he said, testing. "I think it's great Derek's finally going to have some stability," I said and reached for the wine. Under the table, my phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't check it until later, in my car in the dark, 3 blocks from my parents' house. It was an email from the county recorder's alert system, one I'd set up years ago and forgotten about, notifying me that a new document had just been filed against 4417 Brookhaven Lane. I sat in my car under a streetlight on Maple Court and read the filing twice before I let myself react to it. A quitclaim deed. My father had transferred the property to Derek that same day, before dinner. It looked like, based on the timestamp, which meant the whole conversation at the table had been theater. He hadn't been telling us his plan. He'd been telling us what he'd already done. I should have felt angrier than I did. Instead, I felt strangely clear-headed, the way you do sometimes right before you make a decision you've secretly already made. I called Denise from the car. "He filed it," I said. "Today." Before dinner. There was a pause on her end. Not surprise, more like she was doing the same math I was. "Okay. That actually makes this simpler, in a way. Your lien is still recorded, still valid, still ahead of anything they try to put on that property now. A quitclaim deed doesn't wipe out an existing lien, Claire. It can't. Derek took title subject to your note whether he knows it or not. So if they go to refinance, the title company doing the refinance is going to run a full title search. That's standard. When they do, your deed of trust is going to come up. And a $230,000 lien against a house that's supposed to secure a cash-out refinance is going to be a serious problem for that loan. Possibly a deal breaker, depending on the numbers." I thought about Derek's voice at the table. Bank said as long as title's clear, it's not a big deal. He had 30 days. He had a contractor lined up, plans for an addition, a story he'd told his wife and probably his in-laws about how his family had finally come through for him. He had no idea what he actually owned. "What do you want to do?" Denise asked, and I could hear in her voice that she already knew this wasn't a legal question anymore. It was mine to answer. I thought about it for a long moment, watching a neighbor's porch light flick on across the street. Here's what I didn't want. I didn't want to be the villain in some story Derek and Paige would tell for the next 20 years, the bitter sister who blew up their home out of spite the second she found out she wasn't getting one. I didn't want to humiliate my father in front of a room. I didn't, even if I'm honest, want the house. I had my own life, my own condo, my own plans. I'd made peace with never living in that house years ago. What I wanted was simple, and it had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with being seen. I wanted them to understand, clearly and permanently, that the house they were building a future around existed because of me. Not the family. Not some vague, generous help my mother could describe at baby showers without ever saying my name. Me. My savings. My signature on a wire transfer. My decision to save them when nobody else could. And I wanted it to happen in a way they couldn't argue with, explain away, or rewrite later. I don't want to stop the refinance out of spite, I told Denise. I want to be the one who decides what happens to that lien. Not the bank. Not by accident. Me on purpose, in front of all of them. "You want to call a meeting," she said. It wasn't a question. She's known me 20 years. She can hear a plan forming before I've fully finished forming it. "I want to call a meeting," I agreed. We spent the next hour on the phone going through it, what I could ask for, what I was legally entitled to, what would actually hold up versus what would just feel satisfying for about a day and cost me later. Denise pulled the note, the original terms, calculated 6 years of accrued interest on top of the principal, which came out to more than I expected. She drafted a letter. Formal. Certified. I didn't send it that night. I wanted one more thing first. I wanted to hear, in his own words, what my father actually thought had happened to that $230,000. Whether, somewhere in 6 years of retelling the story to himself, he'd actually convinced himself it hadn't been a loan at all. So 2 days later, I called him. Dad, I said when he picked up. I need you and Derek to come by my place Saturday. Just the three of us. There's something about the house you both need to see. They showed up Saturday at 11, my father first, Derek a few minutes behind him, still in his golf clothes, checking his phone like he had somewhere better to be. I'd set my dining table with 3 folders, one at each seat. Not dramatic, just organized. I learned a long time ago that calm reads louder than anger ever does. What is all this? Derek said, sitting down, flipping open the folder before I'd even said hello. It's the deed of trust, I said. And the promissory note. From when I paid off the mortgage on Brookhaven Lane 6 years ago. Derek looked up, confused in a way that told me everything. He genuinely didn't know. In his mind, in the story he'd been told and had apparently believed without question, that house had simply become theirs, a gift from parents to a struggling son, generosity with no fine print. What note, he said. Dad said the house was paid off years ago. That it was just, like, family helping family. I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at either of us. He was looking at the folder in front of him like it might change if he stared at it long enough. Dad, I said. Tell him where the $230,000 came from. Silence. Long enough that Derek's confusion started curdling into something else. Dad, Derek said. What is she talking about? My father finally looked up, and for the first time in this entire story, I saw something in his face that looked less like guilt and more like a man watching a version of events he'd built collapse in real time. It was a loan, he said quietly. From your sister. I was going to pay her back. 6 years, Dad, I said, not unkindly. Just true. You never made a single payment. You never once mentioned it again after the first year. And 3 months ago, I found out from Aunt Linda at a baby shower that everyone in this family has been telling each other you and Mom bought Derek that house outright. That I don't exist in that story at all. Derek's face had gone pale. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at his father, and I understood, watching him, that this wasn't really about me and Derek. It never had been. This was between Derek and Dad. A lifetime of Derek believing he was loved in a way that came without cost, without debt, without anyone else's sacrifice attached to it. I was just the person who'd finally made that cost visible. Here's the situation, I said, and I slid the second document across the table, Denise's letter, the one with the numbers on it. That lien is still active. It's still recorded against the property. It doesn't disappear because Dad transferred the deed to you, Derek. It follows the house. Which means right now, you own a house with a $230,000 debt attached to it that your bank is going to find the second they run title for your refinance. That's not. Derek started, then stopped, because he could see I wasn't guessing. I had the paperwork. I had 6 years of interest calculated to the dollar. I had a filed public record he could go verify himself in about 10 minutes if he didn't believe me. I'm not here to take the house from you, I said, and I meant it, and I watched some of the panic in his face ease slightly cautiously. I'm not going to foreclose on my own brother. That was never the plan, even 5 minutes after I found out what happened. Then what do you want? Derek asked. His voice had lost all its earlier ease. I want the truth to exist somewhere other than a county filing cabinet, I said. I want Mom and Dad to stop telling people a story where I don't exist. And I want the notes satisfied properly, paid back on real terms in writing, starting now, so it stops being a secret debt hanging over a house nobody but me actually protected. I looked at my father. You don't have to pay it back in a lump sum. I never wanted to bankrupt this family. I wanted 6 years of being erased to stop. My father's eyes were wet. Not performing this time. I'd seen him cry exactly twice in my life, and this was the third. I didn't think you'd ever bring it up, he said quietly. I told myself that meant you didn't mind. I minded, I said. I just never said so. That was my mistake as much as yours. They didn't have much of a choice, and to their credit, once the truth was sitting on the table in black and white, none of them tried to talk their way around it. We worked out the terms over the following 2 weeks, with Denise handling the paperwork, so nothing ever again lived only in someone's memory of a conversation. My father agreed to formally acknowledge the debt in writing, co-signed by Derek since the deed was now in his name. They restructured it as a real repayment plan. Modest monthly payments, well within what Derek and Paige could actually afford, running over the next 12 years. Not designed to punish them. Designed to be honest. The addition got put on hold. Derek and Paige were disappointed about that, I know. And for a while, Paige could barely look at me at family gatherings, like I'd stolen something from her nursery plans instead of just asking to be repaid for a house I'd personally saved from foreclosure. That stung more than I expected. But it faded, slowly, the way most things do once people stop needing a villain to make sense of their own disappointment. The refinance eventually did go through. Once the lien was properly disclosed and factored in, smaller than they'd planned. No cash out for construction, just a clean loan on a house with an honest paper trail behind it for the first time in 6 years. Derek called me the week it closed, which surprised me. I didn't know, he said. No preamble, like he'd been rehearsing it. About the money. What you did for the house. I want you to know I didn't know. I believe you. I told him, and I did. I'm sorry, he said. For all the years I let it be a story about mom and dad's generosity instead of asking where it actually came from. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 6 years of being the invisible reason a house stayed standing. But it was real, and it was more than I'd expected, and I decided to let it be enough. My mother took longer. She's still, I think, working out how to tell the story of her own life in a version where she wasn't as generous as she'd told herself she was, where the sacrifice belonged to her daughter and not to her. We don't talk about it directly. But at Easter this year, in front of her sisters, she said, Claire saved that house, you know. Years ago. None of us would still have it without her. And she said it plainly without being asked, without me having to remind her, and I sat there with a forkful of ham halfway to my mouth and let myself feel something I hadn't expected to feel that day. Not triumph. Just relief. My father and I are still working on it too. He calls me now on Sundays again, the way he used to during those 2 good years after I saved the house, except this time I don't think it's guilt driving it, or not only guilt. I think some part of him finally understood that the daughter who didn't need much had, in fact, needed the same thing everyone needs, to be seen for what she'd actually given, not just quietly relied upon for it and then written out of the story. He said something to me a few months ago that I've turned over in my mind more than once since. We were on the porch after Sunday dinner, just the two of us, and he said, I think I convinced myself that because you never made it hard on me, it meant it never cost you anything. It cost me everything I'd saved by the time I was 28, I told him. It just didn't cost me my ability to be quiet about it. Those aren't the same thing. He nodded slowly, like he was actually hearing it, maybe for the first time. As for me, I did eventually buy a place of my own. Not the house on Brookhaven Lane. I never wanted that one. Not really, not even for a second during all of this. A smaller place, 20 minutes from downtown Columbus, with a porch I picked out myself and a mortgage with my name on it and nobody else's. I sit out there most evenings when the weather's good, and I think sometimes about the woman who wired away everything she'd saved without asking for a single thing in return, and how long it took her to understand that being needed and being valued aren't the same thing either. I don't regret saving that house. I'd probably do it again if I'm being honest with myself. But I'd do the paperwork sooner, and I wouldn't wait 6 years to say out loud what it had cost me. That's the part I'd tell my younger self if I could. Not don't help them. Just don't disappear while you're doing it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one holding everything together while someone else got the thank you, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from, and I promise, it only gets better from here.